Hey, so give me 1 minute because I always like to start these off with giving everybody all the links to the endnotes and the vocabulary. And also where if you're using this as a lesson for somebody else or if you're using this as a lesson for yourself, I like you to have the links to like all the worksheets. Like this, if you go to my blog and you're going through the lessons, this is your guided reading part, so you should kind of already be through this. But on my live, I post I have the lesson on my blog the day before we do a guided reading. So, okay, I see myself, and now I'm going to comment. Okay, let's see. The guided reading excerpt is right here. So if you want to read along with exactly what I'm reading along, which is what we're going over right now and tonight, then you click on that link. If you want some critical thinking questions, or if you're using this as a lesson, grab those questions, and then like what I would do is I would get the questions, and they're going to show up and they're going to look like this. And if you don't want to waste paper, then just kind of follow along, pull it up in a web page. And then while I'm going, just listen to the guided reading and kind of look at these questions and kind of think about what I'm saying. Because there's no point to look at me reading, if you want to think about it, So go over click that link to go to the guided questions that involve critical thinking. And just kind of, that's what the guided reading is for. And these are critical thinking exercises. So here we go. I've got those ready for you. Those are in there. And then let me go ahead and give you the vocabulary for tonight. This is the vocabulary for tonight. There are the previous lessons have the vocabulary on my website. And every time we have a word that is considered a vocabulary word, or I might think that it's different and people might not understand it, I put it on the glossary on my website. My website is www.southernfriedsocialist.com, and I'm using the Teaching Tolerance lesson plan, going over the new Jim Crow. And this right now currently is lesson number 4. There's 3 previous lessons. This is the guided reading. I've attached all of the documents that you would need to follow along in the comments, and then right there. And then if you go to my website, www.southernfriedsocialist.com, I have the endnotes that my sources are cited to everything that I'm saying. And you know what? Oh, I'm almost scared to copy and paste it because it might not come out as pretty as it looks right here. Oh, there's only 4 on this chapter, so let's do it. Let's do it. So here we go. Here's your endnotes. There we go. So that way you are able to see what I'm talking about. Okay, tonight is the guided reading, lesson 4. And if you go to my website, I have a link to the entire chapter that's on audio. So like you do not have to buy the book. I'm providing the audio links that I do believe is being read by the author, Michelle Alexander. So if you go to my website, you can listen to the entire chapter all by yourself. This is just the guided reading part where like the hardcore things that, holy cow, did you notice that in that article? That's what this is for. So, and especially if we're going back and using this as a guide. So, chapter 1, the rebirth of caste. The birth of Jim Crow. The backlash against the gains of African Americans in the Reconstruction era was swift and severe. As African Americans obtained political power and began the long march toward greater social and economic equality, whites reacted with panic and outrage. Southern conservatives vowed to reverse Reconstruction. Their campaign to redeem the South was reinforced by a reinsurgent Ku Klux Klan, which fought a terrorist campaign against Reconstruction governments and local leaders, complete with bombings, lynchings, and mob violence. The terrorist campaign proved highly successful. Redemption resulted in the withdrawal of federal troops from the South and the elective abandonment of African Americans and all those who had fought for or supported an egalitarian racial order. The federal government no longer made any effort to enforce federal civil rights legislation. Once again, vagrancy laws and other laws defining activities such as mischief and insulting gestures. Give me 1 second. Make that stop. Once again, vagrancy laws and other laws defining activities such as mischief and insulting gestures as crimes were enforced vigorously against blacks. The aggressive enforcement of these criminal offenses opened up enormous market for convict leasing, in which prisons were contracted out as laborers to the highest private bidder. Convicts had no meaningful legal rights at this time, and no elective redress. They were understood quite literally to be slaves of the state. The 13th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution had abolished slavery, but allowed one major exception. Slavery remained appropriate punishment for a crime. In a landmark decision by the Virginia Supreme Court, Ruffin v. Commonwealth, issued at the height of the Southern Redemption, the court put to rest any notion that convicts were legally distinguishable from slaves. During the decade following Redemption, the convict population grew 10 times faster than the general population. Prisoners became younger and blacker, and the length of their sentences soared. It was the nation's first prison boom, and, as they are today, the prisoners were disproportionately black. After a brief period of progress during the Reconstruction era, African Americans found themselves once again virtually defenseless. The criminal justice system was strategically employed to force African Americans back into a system of extreme repression and control, a tactic that would continue to prove successful for generations to come. Even as convict leasing faded away, strategic forms of exploitation and repression emerged anew. Redemption marked a turning point in the quest by dominant whites for a new racial equilibrium. Equilibrium is the normaling out of things. Everything's normal. Nothing's out of balance. If you have good bacteria in your gut, you won't get sick. If it flourishes, it's not in equilibrium. If you need help with that, that's one of our vocabulary words, and it is on the site in our glossary and also on a previous lesson. Sorry. Where was I? I'm so sorry. Redemption marked a turning point in the quest by dominant whites for a new racial equilibrium, a racial order that would protect their economic, political, and social interest in a world without slavery. Segregation laws were proposed as part of a deliberate effort to drive a wedge between poor whites and African Americans. These discriminatory barriers were designed to encourage lower-class whites to retain a sense of superiority over blacks, making it far less likely that they would sustain interracial political alliance aimed at toppling the white elite. The laws were, in effect, another racial bribe. As William Julius Wilson has noted, as long as poor whites directed their hatred and frustration against the black competitor, the planters received a class of hostility listen to that statement, y'all. As long as poor whites directed their hatred and frustration against the black competitor, the plantations were relieved of class hostility directed against them. Indeed, in order to overcome the well-founded suspicions of poor and illiterate whites, as they, as well as some blacks, were in danger of losing the right to vote, the leaders of the movement persuaded an aggressive campaign of white supremacy in every state prior to black disenfranchisement. So listen, right there, this is me talking. This is not the text. When it's talking about as long as poor whites directed their hatred and frustration against a black competitor, you know what that makes me think of? All those Mexicans are coming to the United States and stealing our jobs. You know what that makes me think of? That's exactly what that makes me think of. Sorry, going back to the text. History seemed to repeat itself, just as the white elite has successfully driven a wedge between poor whites and blacks following Bacon's rebellion. By creating the institution of black slavery, another racial caste was emerging nearly 2 centuries later, in part due to efforts by white elites to decimate a multiracial alliance of poor people. By the turn of the 20th century, every state in the South had laws on the books that disenfranchised blacks and discriminated against them in virtually every sphere of life, including lending sanctions. That's who gives you money for your house. Mortgage brokers. Lending sanctions to a racial ostracism that extended to schools, churches, housing, jobs, restrooms, hotels, restaurants, hospitals, orphanages, prisons, funeral homes, morgues, and cemeteries. Politicians competed with each other by proposing and passing even more stringent, oppressive, and downright ridiculous legislation, such as laws specifically prohibiting blacks and whites from playing chess together. The public symbols and constant reminders of black subjugation were supported by whites across the political spectrum, though the plight of poor whites remained largely unchanged. For them, the racial bribe was primarily psychological. Keep that in mind. What do you think that means? You're not getting anything out of it, really. It is purely psychological. And we're talking about planar elite. And if we go back to the last lesson, that was all the people, the rich people, that 1%. That would be the equivalent today. The new racial order, known as Jim Crow, a term apparently derived from a minstrel show character, was regarded as the final settlement, the return to sanity, and the permanent system. Of course, the earlier system of racialized societal control, slavery, had also been regarded as final, sane, and permanent by its supporters. Like the earlier system, Jim Crow seemed neutral, and it became difficult to remember that alternative paths were not only available at one time, but nearly embraced. The death of Jim Crow. Scholars have long debated the beginning and end of Reconstruction, as well as exactly when Jim Crow ended the Civil Rights Movement, or Second Reconstruction began. Reconstruction is most typically described as stretching from 1863, when the North freed the slaves, in 1877, when it abandoned them and withdrew federal troops from the South. There is much less certainty regarding the beginning and the end of Jim Crow. The general public typically traces the death of Jim Crow to Brown versus Board of Education. Although the institution was showing signs of weakness years before, by 1945, a growing number of whites in the North had concluded that the Jim Crow system would have to be modified, if not entirely overthrown. The consensus was due to a number of factors, including the increased political power of blacks due to migration due to the North, and the growing membership and influence of the NAACP, particularly its highly successful legal campaign challenging Jim Crow laws in federal courts. Far more important, in the view of many scholars, however, is the influence of World War II. The blatant contradictions between the country's opposition to the crimes of the Third Reich against European Jews and the continued existence of a racial caste system in the United States was proving embarrassing. Severely damaging the nation's credibility as a leader of the free world. There was also increased concern that without greater equality for African Americans, blacks would become susceptible to communist influence, given Russia's commitment to both racial and economic equality. So not only are we talking about Russia being committed to both racial and economic equality while they're, being awfully hateful to their LGBT. This is me talking, not the text. While they're talking to their hateful to their LGBT system, but especially in the era of Trump, I think it's really funny this United States was proving embarrassing, severely damaging the nation's credibility as a leader of the free world because of their hypocrisy in the way that what was supposed to happen and what was actually happening. I think that's awfully interesting. Moving on. The Supreme Court seemed to agree. In 1944, in Smith versus Allwright, Allwright, the Supreme Court ended the use of the all-white primary election. And in 1946, the court ruled that states' laws requiring segregation on interstate buses were unconstitutional. 2 years later, the court voided any real estate agreements that racially discriminated against purchasers, and in 1949, the court ruled that Texas segregated law school for blacks was inherently unequal and inferior in every respect to its law school for whites. In 1950, the McLaurin, McLaurin versus Oklahoma is declared that Oklahoma had to desegregate its law school. Thus, even before Brown, the Supreme Court had already begun to set in motion a striking pattern of desegregation. Brown versus Board of Education was unique, however. It signaled the end of the home rule in the South with respect to racial affairs. Earlier decisions had chipped away at the separate but equal doctrine. Yet Jim Crow had managed to adapt to the changing legal environment, and most Southerners had remained confident that the institution would survive. Brown threatened not only to abolish segregation in public schools, but also, by implication, the entire system of legalized discrimination in the South. After more than 50 years of nearly complete deference to Southern states and non-interference in their racial affairs, Brown suggested a reversal in this course. A mood of outrage and defiance swept the South, not unlike the reaction to emancipation and the Reconstruction following the Civil War. Again, racial equality was being forced upon the South by the federal government, and by 1956, Southern white oppression to desegregation mushroomed into a vicious backlash. Past is prologue, y'all. Past is prologue. I am going, for anybody that has joined me, I am going over Teaching Tolerances lesson plan right now for the book study of the new Jim Crow. And I have started a new blog because talking about cooking recipes and crafts was not going to ensure my child's survival in the future. So I turned it into a crazy socialist overnight. And so this is talking about race and racism, and we're studying this book. Right now we're on lesson 4, and if you go to my blog, you can catch up on all the lessons. This can be taught to anybody, or this can be done as a course at home. www.southernfriedsocialist.com. So we're going on the Brown versus Board of Education. That's what we just talked about. White citizen councils were formed in almost every southern city and backwater town, comprised primarily of middle to upper class whites in business and the clergy. Just as southern legislatures had passed the black codes in response to the early steps of Reconstruction. In the years immediately following Brown versus Board, 5 southern legislatures passed nearly 50 new Jim Crow laws. In the states, resistance turned violent. The Ku Klux Klan reasserted itself as a powerful terrorist organization, committing catastrophes such as killings and the bombings of black homes and churches and castrations. NAACP leaders were beaten, pistol whipped, and shot. As quickly as it had begun, desegregation across the South ground to a halt. In the absence of a mass grassroots movement directly challenging the racial caste system, Jim Crow might be alive and well today. Yet in the 1950s, a civil rights movement was brewing, emboldened by the Supreme Court's decision and a shifting domestic and international political environment. With extraordinary bravery, civil rights leaders and activists and progressive clergy launched boycotts, marches, and sit-ins protesting the Jim Crow system. They endured fire hoses, police dogs, bombings, beatings by white mobs, as well as by the police. Once again, federal troops were sent to the South to provide protection for blacks attempting to exercise their civil rights, and the violent reaction of white racists was met with horror in the North. I can say, this is a side note, this is not for the text. I have been to a few protests, and I have had police officers put guns in my face. I am from the South, and I have law enforcement in my family, and I know my rights, and I have been assaulted by police officers before. This is still going on today. It's just, you have to get out of your normal, I'm waking up, I'm having breakfast, I'm going to work, I'm getting groceries, I'm coming home, I'm getting up, I'm going to breakfast, I'm taking you have to get out of that shift. And then it was really unsettling for me the first couple of times, but I hate to say it, but you get used to it. But I know that my friend, the same time that I was in Standing Rock, went to a protest here in Texas, and they were really unsettled by the fact that police surrounded them with guns in their face, and they were really hurt, and I was like, I'm kind of used to it. And they were like, do you know how wrong that is? And I'm like, oh no, I know. Moving on in the text. The dramatic high point of the civil rights movement occurred in 1963. The Southern struggle had grown from a modest group of black students demonstrating peacefully at one lunch counter to the largest mass movement for racial reform and civil rights in the 20th century. Our country was built on protest. In fact, there's a really big building in the United States, like Capitol, that says that you're supposed to protest. Anyway, moving on. On June 12, 1963, President Kennedy announced that he would deliver to Congress a strong civil rights bill, a declaration that transformed him into a widely recognized ally of the civil rights movement. Following Kennedy's assassination, President Johnson professed his commitment to the goal of the fullest assimilation of more than 20 million Negroes into American life and ensured the passage of comprehensive civil rights legislation. I promise you we'll get there at some point. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 formally dismantled the Jim Crow system of discrimination in public accommodations, employment, voting, education, and federally financed activities. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 arguably had even greater scope and was rendered illegal. It rendered illegal numerous discriminatory barriers to elective political participation by African Americans and mandated federal review of all voting regulations so that it would be possible to determine whether their use would perpetuate voting discrimination. So, Kennedy's assassination. Like, I would really look back on the speech. It is public knowledge, his speech. But same thing with Martin Luther King. He didn't get assassinated because he was talking about getting equality for blacks. He got assassinated because he figured out that if he united, it was all the poor people against the elite. And if you look, like, that is why he was assassinated. The elite see it as he should have stayed in his place and just talked about the blacks. As soon as he started trying to talk about, let's unite everybody, it would have been another Bacon's Rebellion, which we go over in the chapter before. And what was the Bacon's Rebellion? It was a man who, way back in the slave days, united indentured servants and slaves and all this to rise up against the planter elite, burn their property, burn their land, and said, we ain't going to listen to you, because they were being they lived in absolute poverty. They were taking back what the rich had stolen, and that is why the racial caste system was developed. So, moving on. We're using Teaching Tolerance lesson guide. We're on lesson 4 right now, but I've provided all the information for the previous lessons. We are continuing our guided reading because this is going on the website and I do not want to keep it too terribly long. I'm trying to keep it like a class period, at least 30 to 40 minutes. While dramatic progress was apparent in the political and social realms, civil rights activists became increasingly concerned that without major economic reforms, the vast majority of blacks would remain locked in poverty. Thus, at the peak of the civil rights movement, activists and others began to turn their attention to the economic problems, arguing that socioeconomic inequality interacted with racism to produce crippling poverty related to social problems. As the civil rights movement began to evolve into a poor people's movement, it promised to address not only black poverty, but white poverty as well. Martin Luther King and other civil rights leaders made it clear that they viewed the eradication of economic inequality as the next front in the human rights movement and made great efforts to build multiracial coalitions that sought economic justice for all. Shortly after his assassination, he envisioned bringing to Washington, D.C. thousands of the nation's disadvantaged in an anti-racial alliance that embraced rural and ghetto blacks, Appalachian whites, Mexican Americans, Puerto Ricans, and Native Americans to demand jobs and income, the right to live. In a speech delivered in 1968, King acknowledged that there had been some progress for blacks since the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, but instead that the current challenges required even greater resolve and that the entire nation must be transformed for economic justice to be made more than a dream for poor people of all colors. While the success of the civil rights movement and the launching of the poor people's movement, it was apparent to all the major disruption in the nation's racial equilibrium had occurred. Conservative whites once again to search for a new racial order that would conform to the needs and constraints of the time. This process took place with the understanding that whatever the new order would be, it would have to be formally race neutral. It could not involve explicit or clearly intentional race discrimination. A similar phenomenon had followed slavery and Reconstruction as white elites struggled to define a new racial order with the understanding that whatever the new order would be, it could not include slavery. Jim Crow eventually replaced slavery, but now it had too died, and it was unclear what might take its place. Barred by law from invoking race explicitly, those committed to racial hierarchy were forced to search for new means of achieving their goals, and according to the new rules of American democracy. Proponents of racial hierarchy found they could install a new racial caste system without violating the law, or the new limits of acceptable political discourse by demanding law and order rather than segregation forever. So, let's see. Oh, how long have I been on this? It won't tell me how long I've been on this. Okay, so how did harsh enforcement of vagrancy laws threaten to place African Americans into a new form of slavery? As soon as it became illegal to racially discriminate, they just completely right behind that put it in. Okay, well, and then if they break the law, they have to do this, and then they can be my slave. They automatically did that. That's how I see it. You can see it how you want. Go back and, read the text. And I'm just kind of going over some of these questions that I've gotten highlighted that I wanted to point out. But let's see. Oh, that's a good one. What 2 factors does the author identify as significant in bringing about a Northern consensus that Jim Crow had to end? Do y'all remember that? I can't believe all this. Like, when I first read this book, I was like, you're crazy. This consensus was due to a number of factors, including the increased political power of blacks due to migration to the North, and the growing membership and influence of the NAACP, particularly its highly successful legal campaign, and how it was so freaking hypocritical that we were like, man, them Nazis are bad. Get back to work. Hypocrisy. So, this was our lesson number 4, guided reading. And there are some questions on the website that I've provided you. And I've also provided you exactly what I'm saying right here. But if you want to listen to the entire chapter, I've provided that with you as well. Go to www.southernfriedsocialist.com. And thank you. I may get on and do the next lesson later. I haven't decided because I've got it ready to go. Thank you.